In the spring of 1942, America was losing. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the news from every front was catastrophic. Wake Island had fallen. Guam was gone. The Philippines were being overrun. Singapore, Britain's great fortress in the east, had surrendered. Japanese forces were advancing through Burma, threatening India. The Pacific had become a Japanese lake, and the United States seemed powerless to stop it. American morale was collapsing. The country that had entered the war confident of quick victory now faced the possibility of protracted defeat. Citizens listened to radio reports of one disaster after another, watching their government struggle to explain how the most powerful navy in the world had been caught by surprise and devastated. The military needed a victory, any victory, no matter how small, to prove that Japan wasn't invincible, that America could strike back, that the war wasn't already lost. What they got was something nobody thought possible. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers appeared over Tokyo in broad daylight and dropped bombs on the Japanese capital. The attack came from nowhere, delivered by aircraft that shouldn't have been able to reach Japan, launched from a carrier that couldn't possibly launch them. It violated every assumption about what was operationally feasible. It shouldn't have worked. But it did. And in working, the Doolittle raid became more than a military operation. It became a legend. Not because it inflicted massive damage, which it didn't. Not because it was executed flawlessly, because it wasn't. The Doolittle raid mattered because it was impossible, and 80 men did it anyway. This is the story of how desperation, innovation, and sheer stubbornness combined to create one of the most audacious military operations in American history. The idea that nobody believed. The concept originated in January 1942 with Captain Francis Lowe, a submariner on Admiral Ernest King's staff. Lowe had been inspecting naval facilities near Norfolk, Virginia, when he noticed Army bombers practicing short-field takeoffs on a runway marked to simulate a carrier deck. The sight triggered a question. Could Army bombers actually take off from a carrier? The idea seemed absurd. Aircraft carriers were designed for naval aircraft. Relatively lightweight planes with folding wings, reinforced landing gear, and tailhooks for arrested landings. Army bombers were heavy, land-based aircraft with fixed wings and no carrier modifications. The Navy's carrier decks were long enough for naval aircraft to take off with room to spare. But a B-25 Mitchell bomber, weighing over 27,000 pounds fully loaded, would need nearly every foot of deck just to get airborne. And there would be no coming back. The bombers couldn't land on a carrier. This would be a one-way trip. Lowe presented the idea to Admiral King anyway. King, known for his difficult personality and willingness to consider unconventional options, didn't immediately dismiss it. He passed the concept to Admiral William Bull Halsey and Captain Donald Wu Duncan for evaluation. Duncan approached the problem methodically. Could a B-25 physically take off from a carrier deck? Possibly, if weight was reduced and the pilot was skilled. Could enough bombers be loaded aboard a carrier to make the mission worthwhile? Maybe, if they were positioned carefully and carried no spare parts or support equipment. Could they reach Japan from a carrier launch point? Yes, barely, if everything went perfectly. The plan that emerged was simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. Load B-25 bombers onto a carrier. Steam toward Japan until within striking range, roughly 400 to 500 miles from the coast. Launch the bombers. They would fly to Japan, bomb assigned targets, then continue west to China, where they would land at friendly airfields. The Chinese would refuel them, and they'd eventually make their way back to American control. Simple. Except nothing about it was simple. The bombers would be flying at their maximum range, leaving no margin for navigation errors or headwinds. The crews would be operating without fighter escort over the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific. If anything went wrong during launch, if a bomber crashed on deck or fell off during takeoff, it could destroy other aircraft and kill dozens of men. The entire task force would be operating deep in waters controlled by the Japanese Navy, vulnerable to attack from surface ships, submarines, and land-based aircraft. And once the bombers launched, there would be no way to recover them. Every crew would bail out or crash land, assuming they even made it to China. The operation required a volunteer force. Nobody could be ordered on a mission with such slim chances of survival. The call went out to Army Air Force bomber groups, volunteers needed for an extremely hazardous mission. The nature of the mission couldn't be revealed. Operational security was absolute. Men volunteered without knowing where they were going or what they'd be doing. They just knew it would be dangerous, and that was enough. Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle was selected to lead the mission. At 45, he was old for combat operations, but his credentials were impeccable. He'd been a pioneering aviator in the 1920s and 30s, a test pilot who'd pushed the boundaries of what aircraft could do. He held a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT. He'd won the Bendix Trophy, set speed records, and survived crashes that would have killed less skilled pilots. If anyone could make this mission work, it was Doolittle. Real quick, please like and subscribe to help our channel grow. Now back to the story. Training for the impossible. Training began in February 1942 at Eglin Field in Florida. 24 B-25 crews, eventually winnowed down to 16 for the actual mission, practiced short field takeoffs obsessively. The goal was to get a fully loaded bomber airborne in 500 feet or less, roughly the distance available on a carrier deck after accounting for the island superstructure and parked aircraft. The B-25 wasn't designed for this. Its normal takeoff run was around 1,500 feet with a full load. Getting airborne in a third of that distance required techniques that violated standard operating procedures. Pilots learned to bring the engines to full power while holding the brakes, then release them and immediately pull back on the yoke to lift the nose wheel off the deck. The aircraft would stagger into the air barely above stall speed, hanging on its propellers until it gained enough velocity to actually fly. It was dangerous and felt wrong to every pilot who tried it. But with practice, it worked. The crews trained without knowing their target. Doolittle maintained absolute operational security. Even most of the volunteers didn't know they'd be bombing Japan until after they'd boarded the carrier. They practiced navigation, low-level flying, and bombing runs against targets that resembled industrial complexes. They modified their aircraft, stripping out unnecessary weight and installing extra fuel tanks in every available space. The B-25s that would eventually fly to Japan carried fuel in their bomb bays, in tanks mounted where their bottom gun turret should be, and in every structural void that could be made to hold a bladder tank. Defensive armament was reduced. These bombers would rely on speed and surprise rather than fighting their way through enemy defenses. Each aircraft would carry 4 500-pound bombs, a light load by strategic bombing standards, but all they could manage with the fuel requirements. The bombs themselves were a mix of high explosive and incendiary types, chosen to maximize psychological impact rather than pure destructive power. In early April, 16 B-25s were loaded aboard USS Hornet at Naval Air Station Alameda in California. The sight was surreal. Heavy Army bombers crowded onto a carrier deck, their wingtips overhanging the sides, lashed down with chains to prevent them from shifting in rough seas. Navy personnel looked at the aircraft and wondered how they'd ever get airborne. Some bet they wouldn't. The bombers were too heavy, the deck too short, the whole concept too insane. Hornet departed on April 2nd, accompanied by the carrier USS Enterprise and their escort ships. The task force steamed west toward Japan, maintaining radio silence, avoiding shipping lanes, trying to remain undetected. Aboard Hornet, the bomber crews finally learned their target. On April 13th, Captain Mark Mitcher announced over the ship's loudspeaker, "This force is bound for Tokyo." The cheering could be heard throughout the ship. The plan collapses. The original plan called for launching the bombers on April 19th from a point roughly 400 miles off the Japanese coast. This would occur at night, allowing the bombers to approach Tokyo in darkness, drop their bombs around dawn, and escape in daylight for the flight to China. It was still dangerous, but the timing provided some protection. That plan died at dawn on April 18th when the task force encountered a Japanese patrol vessel, the fishing boat Nito Maru, stationed as an early warning picket about 650 miles from Japan. The boat spotted the American ships and began transmitting radio signals before being sunk by gunfire from USS Nashville. The Japanese now knew an American fleet was approaching. They didn't know about the bombers aboard Hornet, but they knew something was coming. Japanese defenses would be alerted, fighters would be scrambled. The task force was compromised. Admiral Halsey faced an immediate decision: turn back and abort the mission or launch immediately. 200 miles farther from Japan than planned, in daylight rather than at night, 10 hours earlier than scheduled. Turning back meant the mission had failed before it began. Launching meant asking the bomber crews to fly even farther on fuel that was already calculated to the margins of impossibility. Doolittle didn't hesitate. Launch. Launch now, before Japanese aircraft could find the task force, before the window of surprise closed completely. The mission had always been marginal. Now it was nearly suicidal. But there was no going back. The bombers had been loaded. The ships were in position. The only question was whether the mission would fail completely or just probably. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's bomber, first in line, began its takeoff run. Hornet was steaming into a 40-knot wind, giving the heavy bomber every advantage. The deck pitched and rolled in heavy seas. Doolittle brought the engines to full power, released the brakes, and felt the B-25 accelerate down the deck. Navy deck handlers watched, certain they were about to see a crash. The bomber reached the bow, dropped below the flight deck level as it ran out of runway, then clawed its way back into the air. It had worked. Barely. 15 more bombers followed at carefully spaced intervals. Each takeoff was a controlled emergency. Pilots fighting to get airborne before running out of deck, the aircraft teetering on the edge of stall as they cleared the bow. Every single bomber made it off successfully, a feat that surprised even the crews themselves. Within an hour, all 16 aircraft were airborne, formed up loosely, and heading west toward Japan. Behind them, the task force turned east and ran for home at maximum speed. They'd delivered the bombers. Now it was up to the Army Air Force. Over the Empire. The flight to Japan took about 5 hours, during which the crews faced multiple challenges that hadn't been fully anticipated during planning. The early launch meant they'd arrive over Japan in daylight, increasing visibility for Japanese defenders, but also making navigation easier. The extra 200 miles added to their fuel consumption, eating into reserves that were already marginal. Some crews flew at low altitude to avoid radar detection. Others climbed higher to conserve fuel. There was no coordinated plan now. Each crew made its own decisions about how to approach the target. Japan's air defenses, alerted by the patrol boats' warnings, were searching for American ships, not American bombers. Nobody expected land-based aircraft to attack the home islands. The concept was so far outside Japanese defensive planning that even when the B-25s appeared, some defenders didn't immediately recognize them as hostile. Several bombers flew past Japanese airfields where fighters were taking off to search for the American fleet. The fighters ignored the bombers, assuming they were Japanese aircraft. Doolittle reached Tokyo around noon and found the city spread below him, undefended and unprepared. Anti-aircraft fire was scattered and ineffective. The guns were positioned to defend against high-altitude attack, not bombers coming in at rooftop level. He lined up on his assigned target, an industrial facility in northern Tokyo, and dropped his 4 500-pound bombs. The explosions were visible from the cockpit as he turned away, heading west toward China. The other bombers spread across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, hitting targets ranging from oil refineries to steel mills to military arsenals. The bombing was more symbolic than strategic. 16 bombers carrying 4 bombs each couldn't inflict significant damage on Japan's war economy. But the psychological impact was enormous. Air raid sirens wailed across Japanese cities for the first time. Citizens who'd been told they were safe from attack watched American bombers fly overhead unopposed. The myth of invulnerability shattered in the time it took 4 bombs to fall. Japanese fighters eventually scrambled, but most arrived after the bombers had already departed. A few interceptors caught up with B-25s and engaged them. But the bombers' speed and low-altitude flight made effective interception difficult. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as Japanese gunners oriented to the threat, but achieved few hits. All 16 bombers successfully struck their targets and escaped Japanese airspace. The attack itself had worked. Now came the hard part, getting home. The long night. The flight from Japan to China required crossing the East China Sea, a distance of roughly 1,200 miles depending on exact routing. The B-25s, already near their fuel limits because of the early launch, now faced headwinds and deteriorating weather. Some crews climbed to altitude to maximize fuel efficiency. Others stayed low to avoid Japanese fighters based in occupied China. All of them watched their fuel gauges drop steadily toward empty. Darkness fell as the bombers approached the Chinese coast. The weather deteriorated into a full storm. Wind, rain, and complete cloud cover that made visual navigation impossible. The plan had called for arriving in daylight, locating the friendly airfields, and landing safely. Instead, the crews were arriving in darkness and storm, flying on fumes, with no radio navigation beacons to guide them, because the Chinese hadn't received word to activate them. One by one, the bombers ran out of fuel. Most crews chose to bail out rather than risk a night crash landing in mountainous terrain. The bailouts were chaotic, crewmen jumping into darkness, parachutes deploying into rain and wind, men landing scattered across miles of Chinese countryside with no idea where they were or whether they were in friendly or Japanese-occupied territory. Doolittle's crew bailed out over China after their fuel gauges read empty. Doolittle himself landed in a rice paddy, covered in mud but alive. His crew scattered across several miles, eventually reuniting after dawn revealed they'd landed near each other. Chinese civilians found them, some friendly and helpful, others suspicious of foreigners dropping from the sky. 11 complete crews eventually made it to safety with help from Chinese civilians and military forces. The Chinese, despite Japan's brutal occupation, risked their own lives to rescue and hide American airmen. Thousands of Chinese would later be killed in retaliation raids conducted by Japanese forces specifically to punish civilians for helping the Doolittle Raiders. But not all crews escaped. One bomber, running critically low on fuel, diverted to Vladivostok in the Soviet Union. The Soviets impounded the aircraft and interned the crew. Though the Soviet Union and United States were allies, the Soviets maintained official neutrality toward Japan and couldn't openly assist Americans who'd attacked Japanese territory. The crew spent 13 months in internment before escaping to Iran with Soviet assistance, a diplomatic fiction that satisfied everyone. 8 raiders were captured by Japanese forces. 3 were executed by firing squad in October 1942, convicted of crimes against humanity in a show trial. A 4th died in captivity. The remaining 4 survived brutal imprisonment until war's end, enduring starvation, disease, and torture. Their treatment violated every international law regarding prisoners of war. But Japan operated under different rules in its sphere of control. 3 men died in bailout accidents or crashes. Lieutenant Bill Farrow, co-pilot Harold Spatz, and Sergeant Dean Hallmark were among those executed. The losses were significant in absolute terms, 11 men killed or executed out of 80, but far lower than pre-mission estimates had suggested. Many planners had expected none of the crews to survive. The aftermath that changed everything. The immediate military impact of the Doolittle raid was minimal. The bombs dropped on Japanese cities caused relatively little damage. Some buildings destroyed, some fires started, a few dozen casualties. Japan's war economy continued functioning without interruption. No major military installations were significantly damaged. By conventional measures, the raid was a pinprick, annoying but not strategically meaningful. But the psychological impact was seismic. The Japanese leadership was stunned that American bombers had reached Tokyo. The attack exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in Japanese air defenses. It demonstrated that the Pacific Ocean, which Japan considered a protective barrier, could be crossed by American forces. Most critically, it shattered the Japanese population's confidence that their government could protect them. Emperor Hirohito, who'd been assured by military leaders that Japan was invulnerable to attack, demanded explanations. The Japanese press initially tried to downplay the raid, claiming minimal damage. But citizens who'd witnessed the attack knew better. The psychological blow to Japanese morale was significant. If America could strike Tokyo just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, what else might they do? The raid forced Japan to divert resources to home defense. Fighters that might have been deployed to frontline theaters were kept back to defend Japanese cities. Anti-aircraft guns and radar installations were installed throughout the home islands. The Japanese military initiated plans for a defense-in-depth strategy that would prevent future carrier raids. This resource diversion, while not immediately decisive, contributed to Japan's eventual defeat by forcing them to defend everywhere rather than concentrate forces. More immediately, the raid triggered Japanese planning for the Midway operation. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had been advocating for an operation to draw out and destroy the American carrier fleet. The Doolittle raid gave him the political leverage to launch that operation. The Battle of Midway, fought just 6 weeks later, would become the turning point of the Pacific War. And it happened in part because the Doolittle raid convinced Japanese leadership they needed to eliminate the American carrier threat immediately. For the United States, the raid's impact on morale was exactly what had been hoped for. After 4 months of unrelenting bad news, Americans finally had a victory to celebrate. The details remained classified. Nobody knew where the bombers had come from or how they'd reached Japan. When asked, President Roosevelt jokingly said they'd flown from Shangri-La, a reference to the fictional Himalayan paradise from the novel Lost Horizon. The mysterious nature of the attack only enhanced its psychological value. Doolittle, who'd expected to be court-martialed for losing all 16 bombers, instead received the Medal of Honor. He'd led a mission that accomplished everything it set out to do: striking Japan, boosting American morale, and proving that audacity could overcome numerical disadvantage. The fact that he'd done it against impossible odds, with marginal equipment and inadequate planning time, only made the achievement more remarkable. Legacy written in contrails. The Doolittle raid became legend almost immediately. The men who flew it, the Doolittle Raiders, became heroes. Their story was told and retold, simplified and dramatized, until it achieved a mythological quality that sometimes obscured the actual history. But beneath the mythology lay genuine achievement that transcended the mission's limited physical impact. The raid proved that American forces could innovate under pressure. Loading Army bombers onto Navy carriers violated doctrine and conventional wisdom. Making it work required cooperation between services that hadn't always collaborated effectively. The fact that it succeeded demonstrated organizational flexibility that would prove essential throughout the war. It validated the concept of carrier-based strike operations. While the Doolittle raid used land-based bombers launched from carriers rather than carrier aircraft, it demonstrated that carriers could project power far beyond their defensive perimeters. This concept would be refined and developed throughout the Pacific War, eventually becoming the dominant naval warfare paradigm. More philosophically, the raid embodied a particularly American approach to warfare. The willingness to attempt operations that seemed impossible because the alternative was accepting defeat. The Japanese, with their rigid planning and emphasis on conventional doctrine, would never have attempted something as operationally marginal as the Doolittle raid. American forces, more comfortable with improvisation and risk-taking, made it work through sheer determination. The Raiders themselves became a brotherhood. They held annual reunions for decades, gathering to remember the mission and honor those who didn't return. As their numbers dwindled, age and time claiming what Japanese defenses couldn't, the reunions took on increasing poignancy. The last public reunion occurred in 2013, with only 4 Raiders still alive. The final Raider, Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, died in 2016 at age 94. At their reunions, the Raiders conducted a private ceremony involving a bottle of Hennessy cognac from 1896, Doolittle's birth year. The bottle was engraved with the names of all 80 Raiders. Each year, goblets were turned right side up for those who died since the last gathering, and the surviving members toasted their fallen comrades. When only 2 raiders remained, they opened the bottle and performed the final toast. It was a ritual that honored not just the mission, but the bonds forged by men who'd done something nobody thought possible. The mission that proved the point. The Doolittle raid mattered not because it destroyed Japanese cities or crippled their war economy. It mattered because it happened at all. In April 1942, when every indicator suggested Japan was winning and America couldn't fight back, 16 bombers appeared over Tokyo and dropped bombs on the emperor's capital. The attack announced that America was still in the fight, still capable of striking back, still dangerous despite its defeats. The mission succeeded because 80 men were willing to volunteer for something that should have killed them. They took off from a carrier deck that was too short, flew farther than their aircraft were designed to go, attacked the most heavily defended targets in the Pacific, and somehow most of them survived. They did it without adequate preparation, without proper intelligence, without the resources that would be available later in the war. They did it because someone needed to prove it could be done. The physical damage was negligible. A few buildings destroyed, some fires started, minimal casualties. But the psychological impact reverberated through the rest of the war. Japan's strategy shifted. American morale recovered. The myth of Japanese invincibility, which had paralyzed Allied planning since Pearl Harbor, shattered. Suddenly, the war seemed winnable again. History remembers the Doolittle raid as one of the great military operations of World War II, despite its limited tactical impact. It earned that status not through the damage it inflicted, but through what it represented. Proof that courage and innovation could overcome material disadvantage. That impossible missions could succeed through sheer determination. That America would fight back no matter the odds. The mission that should have failed succeeded because nobody told the men flying it that success was impossible. Or perhaps they knew it was impossible and flew anyway, which might be more remarkable. Either way, on April 18, 1942, 80 men defied probability and proved that in war, impossible just means nobody's tried hard enough yet. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.